before the whole NPC meme came out, there was Kanye West running around saying that slavery was a choice, and he was trying to make this bigger philosophical point, saying that basically people are enslaved in their minds. So he, quite possibly was the originator of the NPC meme in some kind of magical way. But I think it's false, and I kind of wanted to start this out or kind of connect it with this other idea I've had, which is Dunbar's chronology. We know about Dunbar's number in terms of individuals can only conceive of other people as being real people. In other words, they can only empathize conceptually with a certain number of people. It could be 200, it could be 1,000, but there's a limited number of people that you can conceive of as people. And I also want to suggest that there's a limited number of people that you can conceive, or there's a limited time frame that you can conceive of as real time, and beyond that it's just abstraction. So you can conceive of, if someone says, I'm going to blow up the planet Earth tomorrow, that would catch your interest. If they said, I'm going to blow up the planet Earth in 40 years, you might think of your children or grandchildren. If they said, I'm going to blow up the planet Earth in 1,000 years, perhaps at that point, you might feel something, you might not. But there's this question of empathy, the question of passion, where Dunbar's number says there is an in-group that I can conceive of as being my clan, my tribe, and outside of that, any affiliation I have to those people is a product of abstraction. I've abstracted the concept of the nation, and then I've applied this term nation and national to this person. And so I see this person, and therefore I feel some affinity toward them. And that's not a natural in-group preference, that's an abstracted in-group preference. We've taken the clan, the tribe, and we've abstracted it, but that takes ideology, basically. And it's not something that you feel in your gut level, in your instincts, in your empathy. So it's the same thing with chronology, that perhaps we can think years ahead or decades ahead, but we can't really think thousands of years ahead. We can't think millions of years ahead. At that point, it's all abstraction. And it's all like, well, maybe this or that or the other thing. So the ability of a group of people to abstract really gives you a significant advantage over others, because just as Dunbar's number limits people's ability to conceive of other people as being real people, Dunbar's chronology, which is a term I just made up, it could already exist, but this limits people's ability to conceive of future events. And if I'm trying to create a system, I'm trying to create an economic model, a capitalist model, communist model, so whatever I'm trying to make, mutualist, or I'm trying to create a system of government, democratic, republican, totalitarian, theocratic, whatever. Or I'm trying to create a religion. I think that's probably the most interesting one, because religion is something where you can intersect with any element of life. You can intersect with metaphysics, you can intersect with social norms, you can intersect with dietary regulations, right? So religion is this all-encompassing, totalistic thing. So if you're asking, what would be the perfect religion? Well, that's a question of time scale. In terms of the here and now, in terms of going about your day-to-day life, like the next day, next week, next month, next few years, or whatever, the religion that you want to be most personally successful is basically going to look like whatever blends in with other people, whatever allows you to interface with other people most effectively. And I would say that is a kind of universalistic religion, a kind of humanism, where you just look at other people and you say, okay, what is your money-making potential? What are your virtues? What qualities about you can I interface with for mutual benefit between us? This is like a capitalist, humanist, secular thing. Like, I don't care if you're Muslim, I don't care if you're Buddhist, we're all in this together, we're all secular humanists, and we're going to overlook our backgrounds, and we're going to work together to form some kind of group or nonprofit or charity or project, and that's how we're going to do good in the world. That is going to be the most successful thing for you. If you're looking then ahead decades or centuries or millennia, very different question. And when you look at the religions that have been most successful over decades, centuries, millennia. It hasn't been the ones that just do whatever is optimal for the moment. Those are two very different questions. If you're asking what is optimal for the moment versus what is optimal for a long-term plan, very different things. I don't have a segue, but I just want to jump back to the whole the question of slavery. Kanye says slavery is a choice. You choose to be a slave. Well, actually, I don't think you choose to be a slave. What he's implying is that people are born free, right? That's the tabula rasa kind of French Enlightenment, Jeffersonian, American Revolution. We're all born free. We're endowed with rights by our Creator. That's the state of nature. Very not Hobbesian, right? And they're just saying that you're born in this kind of noble savagery of you have all these rights and you're free. You're a free noble savage. And then slavery comes by the way of civilization, and slavery comes and you choose it. You accept it as a social contract. You accept the enslavement of media or religion or whatever it's coming to enslave you, and you accept it, and it's a choice. Because you could, like the Braveheart Scotsman or whatever, you could say, give me liberty or give me death. You could yell freedom, and you could choose to die over being enslaved. That's basically what Kanye is saying. And the NPC meme says, these people are choosing to be NPCs. You don't have to be an NPC. You could be this enlightened, free-willed person full of agency. But my argument is that you are a slave, and you don't even get to choose your slavery. Sort of the typical Christian approach is to say you can either be a slave to the devil or you can be a slave to Christ, and that's up to you which one you want to choose. But I would say you're a slave to your passions, and you're a slave to your ability to abstract, and your ability to conceive of other people as being real people, your ability to conceive of abstract timescales and whatever. That determines what sort of passions you have, whether they're the kind of immediate passions, the lusts of the animal kingdom, or whether they're passion to conquer, the passion to dominate, the will that Schopenhauer talked about, globalism, trying to conquer the world, dominate the world. You can be a slave to that. You can be a slave to your own ego, a slave to promoting your own survival. The antinatalists will come in and say, antinatalism is the solution to all this. We just destroy all life. But then, in a sense, you are a slave to the desire for antinatalism, right? So there's no escaping the will. And to go into another topic, when we try to get to the fundamentals, we try to get away from slavery, right? Because we're always trying to escape. That's one of the desires that we have. We're enslaved to this desire for freedom to escape slavery. And we try to break things down to their fundamental, and we ask, what is the most fundamental good? What is our true passion? Because we all understand contradictory passions. We all understand that in the immediate moment we are lazy, we are gluttonous, we are lustful, we have all these desires that contradict long-term desires. We have immediate animalistic desires because of cumulative evolution, that we have an ancestral memory of what it's like to be a rat, essentially, an early mammal, and our whole psychology is built up upon and has accumulated upon that rat psychology. We haven't negated the rat psychology. We haven't gotten rid of it. We haven't destroyed it. We've simply built higher cognitive functions up upon lower cognitive functions, and they're always in conflict with one another. The rat is saying, hey man, we're tired, let's sleep, let's rest, let's be idle. Whereas the higher cognitive functions saying, no, we need to work, we need to produce, we need to be creative. So they're fundamentally in contradiction with one another. So we already understand on a basic fundamental level that our passions, our desires are in contradiction with one another. How do we ascertain which ones are the true desires, which ones are the true will, the true want that is going to be satisfactory to us? Because if we just follow the lower desires, we're going to live in an animal state. We're going to be living in mud huts. And so we say, well, we don't really want that. We really want civilization. So how do we ascertain it? We ask, what is the goodest good? What is the most fundamental good? What is it that we're truly striving for? What is it that civilization builds upon, like, why not live in a mud hut? Why go beyond anything? Why try to accumulate knowledge? And what is the good here that we're seeking? Well, it's life, right? And we're seeking it toward a divine ideal, the ideal being eternal life, perfect life, and infinite life. So eternal life means you live forever. Perfect life means nothing can kill you. You're impervious. You're perfect. It's a perfect system, infallible. And infinite means that it covers all habitats, all environments, the entire universe. And in this way, it cannot be destroyed. These three things are basically mutually interdependent. That a life form could not be considered perfect if it was not eternal. It could not be considered infinite if it was not also perfect, and so on and so forth. Right, so, these three qualities, these three interdependent qualities, and maybe you could come up with more, maybe you think there should be less, but I'm saying that these three basic qualities define the life, the idealization of life that civilization strives for. It takes the human animal and it tries to bring the human animal into a state of more eternal, more perfect, more infinite. So we're using technology to live longer. We're using technology to be healthier. We're using technology to cover more habitats, and so on and so forth. We're becoming more populous. We're becoming more resilient to bacteria or something like that. This is all theoretical. Like in practical reality, you could say that we're pumping our bodies full of xenoestrogens. The environment is full of plastics, which contains xenoestrogens. So we're actually destroying ourselves. We're actually making the individual human more like a rat than in previous ancient times. But regardless, this is just an example of why someone might or someone might prefer civilization over mud huts, is because it's striving toward this divine ideal of life. But then you have to question life. Is that a worthy goal, life itself? Why do we choose life over death? And you could say, well, that's a fundamental distinction. Now we've hit it. This is the fundamental thing, that we choose life over death, and that's what qualifies whether something is good or something is evil. But then you have to question, is life in itself a sustainable goal? Because it seems to me that life and death are always in tension. That if you take life in itself, purely life, and you remove the death principle, you remove the principle of distinction and differentiation, division, speciation, you remove the principle of cutting away, you remove the principle of selection, then life very quickly degenerates and it becomes unsustainable. Cancer is actually a disease of life. The cells reproduce without rhyme or reason. There is no ordering principle upon the cells, and so they simply reproduce and reproduce and reproduce until the organism dies. So the life principle in itself, if it is not culled, there is no negative pressure upon the life principle, then it is in itself not sustainable. And death, as a principle in itself, is also not sustainable. If we simply rigorously apply the death principle, we would kill the subject which intended to inflict death upon other. And this is the antinatalist, right? The antinatalist says, I'm going to wipe out all life on the earth. It's like, well, how far are you going to get with that until you yourself end up deteriorating, dying, and life in your place springs up once again? The whole, civilization artifice is created once again. The cycle continues. You never escape from that. So death, pure death as a goal, is incoherent. Pure life as a goal is incoherent and cancerous, in fact. And that's what we mean when we say pathological altruism, just loving life for itself, never having any ordering principle. You see very quickly it degenerates into ugliness and internal contradiction, where you see these people who are so altruistic and so kind, and they're using all of their intellectual resources to pump money into, broken systems, basically. It is, and this is a feminine principle. You listen to what is the musical that's at The Greatest Showman, and there's a track in The Greatest Showman that goes something like, it'll never be enough. And it's like I'll look up the lyrics. Greatest Showman never be enough. This is sung by like this blonde Nordic woman, and she's saying, all the shine of 1,000 stoplights, all the stars we steal from the night sky will never be enough. Towers of gold are still too little. These hands can hold the world, but it'll never be enough. Blah, blah, blah. And this is sung like uncritically. I mean, this is like villainous, right? This is disgusting. The potential for consumption, and I would call this a feminine aspect, that there is this potential for consumption because the feminine sexual hierarchies and human hierarchies generally are relativistic, right? So a king living in medieval times who doesn't have access to modern plumbing is still considered a king, right? There is no objective standard of what a king is. It's simply relative to his subjects. Well, he lives better than his subjects, therefore he's the king. Now, of course, if you take that medieval king, transport him to the modern day, then we, relative to him, would be a king in terms of our material possessions. Socially, he would still be the king because he has people who are willing to die for him, people who pray for him, and so on and so forth, whereas we have very little social standing in comparison with a medieval king. So when women look at material possessions, they're not looking at them objectively. They're not looking at the diamond and saying, yes, objectively, scientifically, like the crystalline structure of this diamond makes it more valuable than this other diamond. They're looking at it through the prism of relativistic social standing. And this is the same way that we look at all precious metals, right? There's no, well, prior to, technology, there was no practical application for gold. It was just something pretty. And so it was something that just people said, well, we like the aesthetic value of it, and therefore we put a worth on it. We put a value on it. But, when the Spanish went to South America and they brought back all this gold, you sort of had this devaluation of gold. And that proved that, it wasn't the intrinsic worth of the thing that mattered, but it was, you have this supply and demand function. So when we're talking about the pure feminine perspective of being altruistic and loving life and just hating war and hating hate itself, like rejecting the emotion of hate on like this metaphysical ground, like this religion that says, nothing is bad except hate, like everything can be tolerated except hate. That is the same principle which says it'll never be enough. And this is the consumption principle. It's a cancerous principle that you can take a person like this and you can say, like, is this enough? Are you satisfied now? And they'll say, no. We have this, kid with Down syndrome has not yet been made into, an honors student yet. So we still need to pump millions of more dollars into the education system. Or, and they'll get to the point where it'll be interspecies altruism, and they'll say, well, this dog, this canine hasn't been taught calculus, so still we have this interspecies discrimination holding back the dogs. It's really the these nonsense religious types say about IQ testing. They say there's some kind of pressure, the pressure that when you take the test, that IQ testing pressure, there's a technical term for it. I forget what it's called. Stereotype threat, right? There's a stereotype threat against the canines to perform poorly on IQ tests, and therefore, how do we really know that like the canines have a lower IQ or whatever? So, we're talking about all this, and there's just an infinite black hole of consumption. You can always find some problem, some broken system. The principle of entropy means that it's easier to disorder a system than it is to put it into an ordered state. So if I have a stack of dominoes, it takes a lot more energy to stack up those dominoes in a structure than it does to just hit one of them and knock all of them down. And this is true of any system. It's true of human psychology. It's much easier to destroy someone psychologically than it is to build them up. And so I could, very cheaply destroy people psychologically. Not me personally, but just saying that people have the capacity, the capacity for sadism is so much easier than building people up. So you can very easily destroy someone psychologically simply through neglect, right? A child can just be neglected, and as a result, they're doing very poorly. Or the parent, the mother, can be on drugs, and the child is just born with deficiencies and defective traits. That how much does alcohol cost? How much does wine cost? How much do cigarettes or drugs cost? A pregnant mother could spend very little in terms of drug consumption, and then have a child, and you could spend millions of dollars on that child, and you would never take that child to the kind of intellectual heights or moral heights that someone who's born in an optimal environment, given optimal care, whatever that means, too big of a subject for here. But theoretically, it is so easy to destroy people's lives, so hard to build them back up. And this principle of entropy creates a consumption problem. It creates a consumption black hole for the feminine personality, which just says, we've got to seek out the weakest member of our society. We've got to seek out the greatest victim, because this is the infant-seeking mentality. Always seeking to find the infant and care for the infant. But this infant-seeking mentality in a fertility depression, which is what the West is experiencing, also the Northeast Asian countries, they're experiencing this, but I think they have a little different empathy system than Western populations, different video. But basically, the fertility depression relocates the infant instinct from just purely infants to now it's everybody in society. And it's even people outside of the society, it's refugees. So now they're taking their instinct for seeking out infants and helping infants, which are the weakest, most helpless member of society. Now they're relocating that instinct upon refugees and saying, how do we solve this problem? How do we fix all the problems of the world? How do we go out and save all these people? And the answer is, you can't. You actually can't. There is a limit to charity and compassion if all you do is you take up your saved resources, your saved capital, and you invest that into the most broken, backwards areas of the world, and the most broken, backwards people in the world. You are very quickly going to burn through all your cash, all your reserves, and you're not going to have anything left to invest in yourself. And so all you've done is you've given a man a fish, but you haven't taught him how to fish. You've pumped money in aid and free food and resources into these poor places and these poor people, and they've produced nothing with it. And someday you run out, and now they're not going to be able to continue that system because they were never taught how to create the system. They never developed the skills to create civilization. You've just thrust it upon them, and now you've lost your ability to maintain your own civilization because you've depleted your own reserves, and the whole thing collapses. Now that's theoretical. That's not my prediction for the future, but it is the ultimate conclusion of a purely life-driven philosophy. And again, a purely antinatalist, death-driven philosophy is itself incoherent, and itself just leads to a cycle. So if we see that the pure life and pure death drives are incoherent in themselves, unsustainable in themselves, then we see that really both of them sort of lead back to a center balance of tension between life and death, that the two are kind of dependent on one another, that life needs death to kind of sharpen it and to maintain it and to lead to evolution, and that death also needs life in a way that the two are kind of interdependent, and that's maybe a little more metaphysical to explain. It's kind of easier, I think, to explain why life needs death, a little harder to explain why death needs life. But these are basic questions when we ask, well, like, what is the most fundamental good? How do we determine what thing we should be doing at this very moment? I mean, this is the question on everybody's minds individually, is they're asking, what do I do with my future? What do I do in this present moment to build toward that future? So what are my goals, and what's the best way to achieve those goals? And to understand what your goals are, you first understand, well, my passions are in contradiction. So how do I determine, how do I decide between my passions? Well, I have to get down to what is the most good thing. Well, is it life? Is it death? Is it the balance between life and death? And then what is the proper balance? And where do I fit into all of this? And it's a hard thing, and it could be different for many different people. But I would frame it like this. people often think of their individual life, and I think this is somewhat a product of the modern age of how quickly things are changing. But and possibly because of this fiction-driven society that we have, we've moved away from classical religion and classical myth, where the heroes in classical myth and classical mythology are always otherworldly. They're supernatural. They're superhuman. And so when we read about Aeneas, or we read about Christ, or we read about Zeus, or we read about Odin, or we read about Vishnu, we're not reading about ourselves. We're not thinking, oh yeah, I'm totally like Jesus, or I'm definitely like, I can totally sympathize with Odin because I hate when like my eye gets cut out of my head. That's not really what people were doing exactly. Today, everything is so much more humanistic. Characters are supposed to be anti-heroic. They're supposed to be something you can sympathize with, something that you can put yourself in place. And so there's a greater egoism and solipsism now with our modern fiction-driven culture. We're always thinking, oh yeah, I could be Harry Potter. I bet I'm secretly a wizard. I'm going to go off to Hogwarts. And it's very disgusting how you have all these women who are just in love with Harry Potter. I think it's because there's an egoistic, anti-heroic thing to it. And it's the same reason why the same women reject the Bible or they reject ancient myth, and that doesn't appeal to them whatsoever, is because it's the difference between relatable characters, egoistic, solipsistic characters that you can reflect yourself in. Oh yeah, I'm totally like that. That could be me. Versus something above, something heroic and supernatural. So the question is something like, if these elements are all messed up and disconjointed, and where do you see yourself? How do you conceive of yourself? Is it as this egoist, this solipsist who everything's contingent upon you in this view, that you have this one life, YOLO, you only live once, and you have to accomplish everything in this life, and it has to be totalistic, has to encompass everything. You have to be a global citizen, you have to be, loving everyone equally, and you just have to encompass the whole world and do something that's perfect for you, and it's going to you're going to experience everything. You're going to travel to every continent, you're going to meet every kind of person, you're going to do every kind of thing. It's this idea that you should try everything just once. Well, I mean, should you try, jumping off a 12-story building just once, right? There are a lot of things that are destructive to your psychology that you can't undo, in fact. A lot of behaviors are addictive, and in fact, just not trying something might be better than trying it, getting hooked, and then having a bad habit for the rest of your life. Or, there are a lot of unfortunate cases with single motherhood where, someone tried something, and a child was produced, and that child then lacks a father and a healthy home, which is very unfortunate. So this principle of you have to try everything, it's the idea that you in yourself are kind of like this God, and you have to somehow comprehend reality or overcome reality or digest reality in some way. And you have to somehow complete life, like life is a video game, and you have to complete it and do everything, so at the end of your life you say, yeah, I was satisfied. There's this, like an adage about, no one is 80 years old and says, oh man, I wish I only worked one more day, but they do say like, oh, I wish I did this fun thing or that fun thing. I don't think that's true. I think the momentary euphoric dopamine burst that you get from pursuing your lust and pursuing your pleasure is not something that you think back on it depends on who you are, I suppose, but it's not necessarily something you're going to be 80 years old and say, yeah, I wish I had, one more beer, or I wish I danced to one more song or something. You might just say, I wish I had worked one more day so I had solved that problem. I wish I worked one more day to create a future for my children. I wish that I had done something great and lasting that I'd be remembered for. I wish I did a great deed, a selfless deed, that actually would have made my name immortal rather than just experience some kind of hedonistic private pleasure that only I get to enjoy and no one else does. So when you put it in these kind of terms, there is something very destructive about our fiction-driven culture. And I think, Tolkien is to blame for this, that I become more and more convinced when I reflect upon it, that Tolkien is really harmful as a myth maker, and that's why he's promoted. Because his whole thing was, no, it's not going to be about Aeneas, and it's not going to be about, Zeus, it's not going to be about Odin, it's not going to be about supernatural beings, but there's this hobbit, and the hobbit is just a child. And you're supposed to sympathize with the hobbit and see things through the perspective of the hobbit, and ultimately the hobbit is the hero. That this unadulterated childishness is what saves the day. And there is something perverse about that. There is an aspect in myth of like the Christ child, or the pure innocence, like an innocent hero, unperverted, the pure of heart or something like that. But yeah, it gets back to this idea of like, are you reading the myth and projecting yourself into the myth and saying, yeah, that's me, I could be that person, I could be that hero? Or are you instead reading about a hero who is beyond your abilities you're looking at them not as a person, but as an ideal to be strived for? That's something very different. It's not like, oh yeah, I could be Aeneas. It's like, whoa, Aeneas is so far above me, I want to be like him. Even though I could never be like him, I still want to. Or Christ, I read about Christ, I'm not thinking, oh yeah, that's totally what I would do. No, I'm thinking, this guy is so far beyond me, it's a goal to strive for. So it's two very different ways of looking at the world from the perspective of YOLO, I got to do everything in this one lifetime, I got to experience everything, try everything once, because this is my one life that I have to live, and I just want the maximum hedonism, maximum experience, got to visit, travel everywhere, see every new thing, versus no, I have an ideal that I'm supposed to strive for. Understanding that you're a slave. Understanding that you're a slave to lower passions, to higher passions, you're a slave to the God, or you're a slave to the devil, you're a slave to one thing or another, and you can't escape that. And you can fool yourself, but then you're a slave to your illusions, which, I don't know, it seems to me better to be realistic about things. And if we can get to a point where we're being truthful and at the same time not depressed, not pessimistic, I think there are some people who think that being truthful is equivalent to just depressing yourself and being harsh and being pessimistic. I don't think those are the same things. I think if your conception of the truth is that truth makes people unhappy, then maybe your conception of happiness is wrong, or even viewing happiness as the goal is wrong. That there's a difference between euphoria and satisfaction, or euphoria and understanding, euphoria and contentment, euphoria and peace. So, that's just one positive aspect, but we can recognize divinity and not feel euphoria, not feel agitated, but feel whole. We can feel that harmony when we feel in sync with divine truth, and whether or not it's good or bad for us. We have that deep understanding, that deep harmony with it, that recognition of something beyond ourselves. That's the important thing about myth. Real myth, authentic myth, I think, is something that, again, portrays ideals to strive for. And you look at that and you say, how can I position myself within this hierarchy? Where am I? Am I a peasant? Am I a king? Am I a priest? Am I a warrior? There are all these different classes and different stations that one can occupy. But you do have to be honest and truthful about it. If someone is really mediocre in all their talents, but they have this egoism that they must be a king, that they have to be king of the castle, what they'll do is they will layer their reality in illusion until they achieve the illusion that they want. And that can be achieved through video games. This is the sad thing. I remember someone explaining to me when I asked them about, their video game hobby, and they just started, sounding off and saying that, some people like sports and they devote their lives to being athletes. And I don't criticize that. And some people devote their lives to academics, and that's what they want to do. Some people devote their lives to, other people, helping other people, being kind, being charitable. Some people devote their lives to just making money and being rich, acquiring material possessions. I devote my life, this is what he was saying, to video games and to being good at this video game, and I like it and I'm good at it. And who's to say that my hobby or my lifestyle as a video game player is any less worthy than, the athlete or the moneymaker or the charitable person or anything else? It's just a choice, right? We all choose goals and we create our own meaning. And what's the purpose of it? We invent our own reality. We create our own purpose. And so my life as a video game player is just as significant as a star athlete or a philanthropist or anything else. And I felt a deep, sadness. I felt like that was a pretty pathetic statement. And it made me question what I was doing and what other people around me were doing. And it got me scared because he was able to articulate something that I think a lot of people secretly use as a justification for their activities. Well, everyone likes, you like this, I like that. Hey, who's to say that what I do is more worthy than what you do, or vice versa? It's all just equal. It's all just a choice. We all just create our own meaning. And it is very sad. It is an illusion that he ultimately wanted to be someone important. He wanted to be someone who was good at something, and he had to find this video game. And what he was interested in is not doing the most good that he possibly could do, but he was interested in finding a fake reality, an illusion that he could fool himself into thinking, yeah, I'm really top of the game. I'm really good at this. I'm good at what I do. I'm, at the top of the social hierarchy, basically, within his little illusion. And there are many people who engage in this kind of behavior where they funnel themselves into this niche subculture or this hobby, and they say, yeah, I'm the best at what I do. And it's satisfying, because that is something that we all desire, to be the best at what we do. But by wasting those tens of thousands of hours of your life cultivating that skill, you're obviously wasting time that even if you were a mediocre something else, it would probably be better to be a mediocre something else than to be someone who's playing a video game. And playing a video game is ultimately a feminine, consumptive act, even if, it's mostly men playing the video game. You are spending your time, you're wasting your time. You're not creating something. You are taking a creation of someone else, some programmer, and you're just wasting away your hours. You're playing out the simulation that they've invented for you rather than actually confronting the reality in front of you. And if you want to take the metaphysical approach and say that the reality is really just an illusion itself, then you're not confronting, the metaphysics that would lead you to that kind of conclusion. And kind of dissecting the real nature of reality, you're spending your time dissecting strategies in a video game. And this is just an example of what a lot of people do. They're dissecting strategies to be successful at making money. They're dissecting strategies to become successful within a narrow social circle. And they're not really considering deep, fundamental, overarching questions of what's going on. Now, it doesn't mean that you're a free person, you're a free agent if you're doing this. But almost in a way, there is some kind of freedom in understanding the necessity of rules and the boundedness of reality, the limitations of reality. If you understand that, then you are removing a layer of illusion. The person who thinks that they're a completely free agent and that they're master of their domain and everything, and that they're totally without. I guess what I'm trying to say is that a lot of who you are and what you are and what your goals are is sort of situational, and it's when you approach things from this all or nothing perspective of like, well, I either accomplish everything I'm meant to in this lifetime or I accomplish nothing at all and it's all a waste. I think that's the wrong way to go about it. I think if you have an intergenerational approach to living, you say, I personally don't have to fix every problem out there, but I have to find, first of all, I have to get in touch with the greatest good. And you can do this either through doing the metaphysical work yourself and understanding deontology and understanding morality and like getting to what is the most fundamental good that we can do, and then from that basic foundation branching up through the specific locus of the individual and say, okay, well, where are you within the social structure, what are your skills, etc., and how do you act in the greatest harmony with that most fundamental good. You can either do that work yourself or just seek out someone, and this would traditionally be the priest. And the priest would do the work for you, or just the social structure in general would already have planned this out and figured it out for you, probably through lines of heredity, and said like, well, this hereditary line will be the rulers, and this hereditary line will be the warriors, and this hereditary line will be the farmers, and you just kind of do what your father did before you, and boom, there's your plan, and it's all laid out. Now, is that a perfect evolutionary model that takes account of random gene mutations within the population, that takes account of degeneration of hereditary lines over time because of regression to the mean and outbreeding and all kinds of population dynamics? No, I don't think that's a perfect system, as evidenced, you look at who were the monarchs of World War I and World War II, and you can see how they were probably not the best people around, the most fit to lead the country or whatever. So it's not a perfect model. It's maybe not even the most desirable model, but it is a model. So there are different models for doing this, for figuring this out. But someone has to do the work. Like, it could be just one person who does the work, calculates it, and then tells everyone else what to do, or it could be a holistic system, and the system does it like a market calculation, essentially. And that's kind of how capitalism works today, is that capitalism says, like, kind of pressures people through this monetary incentive to find their passion, and then supplies both the, demand of rent, and then, there's this supply of wages, and then people sort of fit themselves in without anyone directly telling them, like, you have to go to trade school, you have to become a philosopher. They just sort of fit themselves naturally into these roles, and there are losers and there are winners because the market's changing, job market's changing, jobs are being created, jobs are being destroyed, supply and demand. So there is a system for doing this already, but you have to ask, what is the fundamental morality of capitalism? Like, capitalism is putting people into slots, but for what purpose? Well, for consumption, basically. That is the feminine nature of capitalism, is that it is constantly trying to increase consumption, trying to increase demand, because that's the fuel that it runs on. If you slash demand, you slash consumption, the whole edifice crumbles, right? You couldn't have capitalism, you couldn't have the market, it would all be destroyed overnight if people just stopped wanting stuff. Whereas like a theological system says, like, you don't have to actually desire what you're doing in itself, and people aren't necessarily in a consumptive mode, that you're doing things for some higher purpose, you're doing something for someone else or something else. Like, you're creating, not for your own pleasures, but you're like building a pyramid for the glory of the pharaoh. You're building the Colosseum for the glory of Rome. And I think in that respect, at least, nationalism has some advantage over capitalism, because capitalism is catering to the demands and the consumptive desires of the individual, whereas nationalism is saying, like, let's do this for the beauty of the nation, for the glory of the nation. Let's do something for something that comes after us, intergenerational, and so you're getting beyond the egoistic, superficial self, and you're at least abstracting to that level. Now, of course, it's not universalistic, it's not the highest level of abstraction, but it is some level of abstraction. So in that respect, I think it has some advantages there. So that's where I would start for people. I would say, look at your family, look at your nation, if you have one. A lot of people don't. But look at these external aspects of your identity. You have the core individual, then the family, then kind of nation, and then you have intersecting Venn diagrams of, well, here's your religion, here's your culture, here's your linguistic group. And you can look at all those things, then look at the history of it, look at the projected future of it, try to get an understanding of that as a basis for how you should rule your own life, or what you should push towards, or what kind of master you should choose to be enslaved to, if possible. Now, maybe on some deeper level you can't choose and you're just sort of destined to kind of walk the path that you're destined to walk, but if that's the case, then let's walk it, and let's embrace it, and let's not have illusions about it. And if you accept it, there's a lot of things you can accept as good and the truth, and two people can be in the same exact material situation but have radically different psychologies about it. It could be chemical, it could be materialistic, but it could be a matter of philosophy and metaphysics and first principles. So it's a very general thing. People can come at you and say, well, if I'm supposed to do this, then should I do that? Should I do the other thing? I think generally action is better than inaction. Production is better than consumption. Because, there are limitations to that statement. As I've said before, pure production is just cancer in biological terms. And so consumption is, you're digesting material, you're discerning, you're perhaps choosing one thing over the other, you're learning. Those are important things to do. But I think there is a tendency in capitalism, because the metaphysics of our economic system, global economics, is this focus on consumption and demand and just consuming, that you can go your whole life just consuming resources and never produce a whole thing in your life. And so for that reason, I would, for this age and for the global capitalistic system that we are in, I would say, try to, whenever you have two choices, go for the one that favors production over consumption, action over inaction, because again, I think so much is just passive, sitting in front of a screen, learning information that is useless, that will never help you at all. So much of what we do in our lives is just the passive consumption. If you don't produce, then there is a sense in which you don't exist. You're just this brain in the jar experiencing hedonic, euphoric dopamine bursts, and you're not actually living, right? So if you have a question, you're like, well, should I travel? Should I do this? Should I do that? Should I take this job? Should I try this or do that? I would say in most cases, if you're considering either doing something or not doing something, just do it. Just do the thing that you're questioning. And then if it turns out to be the wrong thing, well, you've learned your lesson, haven't you? And there are cases in which I do have to caution people that, again, when you're messing around with powerful forces, that's drugs. Drugs are a powerful force. Sex is a powerful force. There are many powerful forces. You do that and you can't take it back. I mean, you can go on a journey, or you can travel somewhere, you can take a job, or you can go through some sort of training, and you can walk into that and you can try it and you can experience it, and you can sort of take a third person view and say, okay, what is this all about? And you can evaluate it, because it's sort of, you still have your psychological integrity throughout the process. You're not like being hypnotized, and maybe there is a slight hypnotization to every experience, but you still have some level of psychological integrity that you can take a step back, and that allows you to distance yourself from the event as it's happening and to limit the damage that it does on you, as opposed to something like drugs or sex or some kind of indelible event where you're accessing the hypnotic theta, deep subconscious. You're affecting your basic chemical psychology. You can't reverse that. You can't change that. So that's dangerous. Like, you can't control that and be certain of, well, should I do this? Should I do that? I would say this, a quick note on it. I mean, if you think you're capable of handling the drug, I would look up, is it addictive or not? And a lot of things, cocaine is not really as addictive as you would think based off the bad reputation that it gets. Marijuana is more addictive than you think, based off what the pro-weed activists say, because there's chemical dependence and then there is dopamine dependence, in that you take something and it makes you feel good, so you're happy and you get addicted to happiness, right? So that's a non-chemical addiction. Like, people get addicted to playing video games. It's not because there's dopamine squirting out of the screen into their neural network. It's because it makes them happy, and there's an internal chemical dependency that you have for dopamine. You can be addicted to food or whatever. So I would say marijuana is or as addictive or more addictive than food. And we know a lot of people are addicted to eating food and bad food and carbohydrates and phytic acid and plastics. So yes, you can be addicted to weed. So it is addictive. It's also a pacifying drug. It makes you passive. It makes you want to consume cereal, children's cereal and children's cartoons. Doesn't sound like, a heroic drug to me. I think cocaine is the more heroic drug. So if you're going to try a drug, research it, find out a little bit about it. Is it addictive or not? And then I would suggest taking it. If you're going to take it, you're going to take it in a special circumstance, socially with other people. Don't make it this thing that you do secretly by yourself, because then there's no limit upon it. And there's nothing really constraining your behavior. Whereas if you say, well, I'm going to do it with these other people in this social setting, then you kind of segregate it to that event. And then it's not necessarily going to produce this private dependence that takes over your life and destroys your productivity. And it can, destroy your neural functioning if you just go overboard with alcohol and drugs. Different people have different responses, especially at a young age. I would say, basically your neural system, when it's growing, when it's still in flux, it's a lot more fragile. After your brain stops growing around 23, it's more stable, and so then it's a lot safer to try out a lot of these drugs. Sex. If you're watching porn, that is a type of sex, psychologically speaking, in terms of your internal chemistry, your dopamine, all of that. Your body perceives it and looks at it in the same way that it would respond to sex. And so, again, it's a question of consumption versus production, action versus inaction. Sitting in your basement and looking at porn is a more passive, non-active process. It's a more consumptive process than actually having to build the social skills, build the physique, build the confidence, build up all those things. It takes effort, and you have to learn how to do it, and you have to actually be sort of creative and active about it, and then the actual sex act itself is more active and productive. So this kind of heuristic can be applied to a lot of different things. I think that's pretty much it from today. If you haven't checked out the Arvel stream, which I'm like halfway through, I did plagiarize a lot of his material. Go check it out. Go check out the deepright.boards.net. Nothing's really going on at the moment, but there's a lot of reasons for that. It's kind of something that is, I think, very easily, it can be started and stopped at a moment's notice, sort of thing. So I don't think it's dead. I think it's just in a lull, and it will return at some point, and that kind of depends on the activity of the users. Can't just be a couple of dudes, has to be a bigger thing than that. So all in all, check those things out. People who are talking about the millennial, I don't know if anyone reached this point in the video, because this is a very forced stream of consciousness rambling video. I would go on it. I don't care. I mean, I don't know what he wants to talk about. I would probably try to take a devil's advocate position, because I think that's the only way that you can have an ideologically robust system, is if you constantly challenge it, and it's not dogma. I mean, dogma works if you have centralized authority. Like, if you have state power, dogma is the way to go. Dogma 100%. I totally support dogma if you have centralized state, military, financial, media power. If you don't, you need to subject your ideological system to constant criticism, and that's why at this point I'm just coming out and saying, like, globalism's the way to go. Nationalism has positive aspects, but not for the reason that people think. The whole question of in-group has to be understood on a deeper level, rather than just superficially assumed that, it's good to do right by yourself in your own group. Well, why? What's the deeper reasoning for that? Like, how do we even understand morality? And how stupid are you really if you just buy into this sort of thing? And like the biological interpretations of race and everything like that. It's just, yeah, it is a very dogmatic thinking that ends up, like they try to do this reflective mirror image of the state-approved ideology and say like, oh, we'll just take, they say it's bad to be racist, so we'll just say it's good to be racist, which is pretty dumb. But it works on a lot of people. Whether it's actually effective at changing the world is a different thing. But yeah, I would probably go into it a little bit, playing a lot of devil's advocate, playing a lot of, questioning like, well, why are we really into this? And maybe that's not the best way to do it. Maybe the best way is to just talk about first principles and talk about like important things that people don't understand, like even the concept of religion in a broader sense. And if you're someone who's like, yeah, I believe everything, that the mainstream tells me, except I also believe in IQ testing. Okay, well, I mean, you haven't really explored the alternatives then. If you just kind of accept the given system, you're like, everything's perfect. We just need to tweak the system of Western civilization. So, like, we just need to turn back the clock to the 1950s and rerun that whole simulation, and then everything will be perfect. We just need to continue rewinding the clock to the 1950s, set it on that morality, continue infinitely into the future. That's completely sustainable. That's great. That's wonderful. Or the people just say, yeah, we should just have the medieval kings again. We'll just turn the clock back to the medieval kings and then keep running that simulation forever. Well, I mean, maybe, right? If history's cyclical, then yeah, sure, maybe. But it is an interesting question to sort of probe. So I don't know. I would be interested in doing it. It's not till December, right? So I'd be interested in doing it. I don't really know what I could do. Maybe you tell me what topics am I strongest on? What do you guys like? What could I talk about? Maybe drop some concepts or something to go through, and we'd see about it. I don't care. The only thing that makes me hesitate is I don't like talking with these personalities who pigeonhole themselves into these places, and they do get dogmatic, and then it becomes more about the drama of the personalities involved rather than the ideas themselves, and these social networks that are created, these niches within niches, these what do you call them, like the Mean Girls style, the cliques that are created. I don't have a lot of interest in that. It kind of turns me off. I've had offers of people who say, oh, come on this stream, come on that stream, and I said, I have a bad feeling about this, and then later I learned that person has a certain marital obligation to someone who's diametrically opposed to their views, and they're getting kicked out of the house, which is like, come on now. Are we gonna do that, or are we gonna skip some of that superficial, day-to-day life stuff that we have to unfortunately deal with, and kind of get to something a little bit deeper and try to understand things on a more fundamental level? Anyway, that really is all for now. Thank you for listening.